What's up, guys? It's Mitch here. Welcome back. Have you ever harshly judged someone for doing something that you found offensive or you really disliked, only to do that same thing only moments later? Have you ever gotten really upset about someone gossiping about you only to do that same thing and probably to that same person? Have you ever gotten upset about someone inflating stories or telling lies that you knew were false only for you to also do that same thing? Whatever it is, I'm sure there's a plethora of things that you've gotten really harshly critical about that are actually like negative, legit, wrong things. But in the gospel according to Matthew, Jesus cautions us about offering harsh criticism. And I want you to stay to the end of the video, but if you're not going to stay, I want you to learn one thing that Jesus teaches us to deal with this issue. And that's an admonishment to look inside our own hearts, to be self-reflective and critical of what's going on in our own heart and in our own lives before offering harsh criticism or even help to others. So if that sounds interesting, I'd encourage you to like the video and subscribe to Faith with Mitch, where we talk about how theology shapes, transforms, intersects with our everyday life. And I'd encourage you to also stay tuned for the rest of the video. Thanks and welcome to Faith with Mitch. Hi guys, welcome back. In this episode of Faith with Mitch, we're going to be examining Jesus' warning concerning casting harsh judgment, his command not to do so, and what I would consider to be the remedy in helping us to address this issue. So let's dive into verse 1. In verse 1, Jesus says, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged." So to get an idea of what Jesus is forbidding here, I want to read a quote by the commentary I consulted for this video called "The Commentary Critical and Explanatory on the Whole Bible." One of its authors, David Brown, says, "The context makes it clear that the thing here condemned is that disposition to look unfavorably on the character and actions of others, which leads invariably to the pronouncing of rash, unjust, and unlovely judgments upon them." And so when Jesus is saying, don't judge, obviously we make value judgments all the time, right? And we live in a morally complicated world. We live in a world that is rife with evil. And we have to navigate that and make moral choices and moral judgments regarding how we're going to live. But that's not what Jesus is getting at here. He's getting at the type of judgment that is unfair, that is overly critical, that is harsh and unwarranted, and just lacks concern, genuine concern for the person. And sadly, we see a lot of that type of judgment, both in the world and even within a church context. And so that's what Jesus is getting at here. And so when he says, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged," I think, obviously Christianity does not endorse the concept of karma, right? Like you did a bad thing, and so a bad thing is gonna come back at you. That's not a Christian concept. But this idea of being overly judgmental towards other people, there's definite legitimacy in other people responding to that, of legitimately of just avoiding you and likely being critical of you in response. And I think that's more of what Jesus is getting at here. And in verse 2, "For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get." Let's examine the first part first. "For with the judgment you make, you will be judged." I think we see this in our lives, in society, where people act like they are for or against a certain thing, right? I'm somebody who really doesn't like gossip, And if I'm overly vocal about that and people know that about me and I'm harshly getting on others, that's going to come back, right? People are going to judge me by these standards that I espouse, these standards that I say that I believe in. And so when you are overly critical, when you are offering harsh judgment, but then you're also hypocritical and you do those same things, you better watch out, because it's going to come back to bite you. And then it says in part 2 of this, in verse 2, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Again, Christianity doesn't endorse karma, but it's what's suggesting here is the amount of harsh judgment that you dish out is the amount you're going to receive. And again, I think we see this in society, that people who are overly critical of others open themselves up to being scrutinized by others to the same degree, if not worse. Verse 3, why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Right? So it's highlighting this idea that you seem to notice all of the wrong in other people in your neighbor's eye, but you can't seem to see, or you're ignorant of, or you refuse to see the greater issue in your own life, right? Or how, in verse 4, how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye while the log is in your own eye? So there's two things that kind of parallel each other here that I think enrich this image, which is the scene. You notice it, you're vocal about it, you're critical of it, but then there's this offer to help, right? It's like, oh, let me help you get rid of this issue when you have a massive issue in your own life, that you would be better to focus that energy on that first and primarily before offering to help. And I think that's why I put it in quotes, there's a suspicion about somebody who has a massive problem in their own life and then offers to help others, right? That we're going to be suspect of like, really? You're helping me? That seems condescending, right? Seems condescending. Are you legitimate? Are you honest? Are you being forthright here? Do you genuinely want to help me, or does this just make you feel good? And I think we're right to be suspicious in at least some of those cases. And then verse 5, you hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. And I think there's a lot of wisdom here in recognizing, like, we can't even see clearly, potentially, if there's this massive issue in our own heart, in our own lives, to help others. And I think of an analogy of like driving on a road. If you don't have your glasses and you're looking out at someone to your left and they're passing you and you think they're going to drive off the road, and you're offering, you're like, hey, get back over here. But you don't actually see the road clearly, right? They're actually on the road and they're doing just fine, but you didn't have the vision, the capacity to see that they were the ones on the right track and you were the one headed off the road. And so I think if we do struggle with this, that just encouragement to focus on our heart, focus on our own lives, and then as we see growth in that, perhaps the criticism that we do offer is more constructive, is more helpful, is not as unkind, right? That is good, productive, loving, because surely it's good to offer good advice in a loving way, in a way that'll be actually received and taken into consideration. And so Jesus is not saying, don't make value judgments. He's saying don't be overly critical. Don't be so suspect, so judgmental towards others in an unnecessary, harsh way, because it's not productive. You could be potentially criticizing in a way that's totally unwarranted, and you need to focus on your own heart. I want to be honest about something, and that is that we're all hypocrites, right? I love the word that Jesus uses for somebody who is overly critical of others but can't see the sin or the issue in their own heart that is even a bigger problem. And the reality is that we all do this on some level. We have a sense of morality, standards that we want to live by. There is no honor among thieves. Well, there are typically some level of expectations among thieves. And so we all have these moral codes that we live by. They're not all the same code, but there are certain expectations even in the darkest communities that are out there. And so on some level, we are all hypocrites. There's God's standards that nobody lives up to, but then there's also our own standards, and we don't even live up to those standards. God, as a perfect judge, has every right to judge us. He knows our heart. He knows our intentions. He knows our record. And yet, as Jesus Christ, he takes that penalty, that cost that we owe, that price that we owe, and pays it for us and shows us grace. And I think for Christians, it's important for us to recognize that as believers, there are certain expectations of being a Christian, of being part of God's community, of being part of the church. That because you have been transformed by the gospel, that because you have encountered and have a relationship with Jesus, like, you're expected, there is a level of expectation to live a transformed life. But I think it's important to note that theologically, if it's God who, makes us aware of our own sin and enables us to believe, then we need to show grace to those who don't. We need to be kind, to be loving. That doesn't mean we need to validate everything about their life. It just means we need to show an extra measure of grace. And I think in encountering that grace, non-believers will taste a little bit of the gospel and hopefully desire more. And it reminds me of that psalm that says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." Psalm 34:8. It's not to suggest that, objective moral standards don't apply to non-believers. It's to suggest that there is a greater level of expectation of moral living when it comes to someone who believes the gospel and is part of God's community, is part of the church, versus somebody who might not even have much of a concept of God at all and doesn't know truth revealed through special revelation. I think we want to close there. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I'd encourage you to like and subscribe to the channel, and check out other videos like the other two I recently did regarding Matthew chapter 6, concerning storing up, the warning concerning storing up treasure on earth, and the encouragement not to worry. Thanks, and catch you in the next video. God bless.